Hello, and welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas into what it means to live as a follower of Jesus in the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Here's your host, Loren Richmond Jr.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. Today I'm welcoming Dr. Michael Chan to the podcast. Dr. Chan is Executive Director for Faith and Learning at Concordia College in Moorhead, Minnesota. Prior to that, he was Associate Professor of Old Testament at Luther Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota. He joined Luther Seminary after completing his Ph.D. at Emory University and a year of research and teaching at the University of Helsinki. He's a graduate of Luther Seminary and Pacific Lutheran University. As the Executive Director for Faith and Learning, Dr. Chan directs the Lorentzsen Center for Faith and Work and the Dovre Center for Faith and Learning. He also guides Concordia's interfaith relationships and oversees the work of campus ministry. All right, welcome to the show, Michael Chan. Anything else you'd like our listeners to know about you?
Just that I am really grateful to be here and to be having this conversation. It sounds like you've had a really rich lineup of folks on the podcast and talking about some really important topics. So hopefully we can, make a little bit of a contribution to that. So thanks for the invitation.
Yes, thanks so much for being here. I've really been fortunate to talk to some cool people and learn from them and get a bunch of free books.
Yeah, that is one of the great things about podcasting is that, the publishers now are quite aware of how important the kind of organic growth that can come from a podcast and sort of micro-targeting audiences this way. And they're more than willing to send books. So that's great.
I just got an email today about I'm going to get a couple of Andy Root books. I'm super excited about that.
Oh yeah, so he's a good friend and a former colleague at Luther Seminary, and in the former podcast, Gospel Beautiful, he was on I think a couple different times. So the recent book he's got on innovation and some of the critique he has there is really important. I mean, it's interesting. Andy, when that book was coming out, Andy and I had lunch together because he knew I thought differently about some things. But nonetheless, it is a book that people should listen, especially kind of at this time when innovation is in the air. As a buzzword, and he offers, I think, an important, commentary. So,
yeah, we're getting into it already here. I just finished a book called Stuck. I think it's from Fortress Press. I'm hoping to have some of the authors on, but they kind of talk about some of the challenges of what they call futurism. This kind of tendency to throw away all the past stuff. Norms and social guidelines of the past for church. Anyway, looking forward already here what we're getting into, but let's get back to basics here. Share, if you would, kind of about your journey of faith, what that looked like in the past, what that looks like today.
Yeah. Well, I was raised within the ELCA church, but in the Southwest. So I'm from Northern Arizona, and currently we live in Moorhead, Minnesota, and so kind of I think like Southwest, West Coast Lutheranism feels really different, than Upper Midwest Lutheranism, partly just because of the cultural differences, right? Like the kind of cultural assumptions that one and mores that one feels up in the Upper Midwest related to Lutheranism just often don't exist in the Southwest, unless you're, of course, in kind of one of these snowbird communities, and then that's a little bit different. But so I'm born and raised in the ELCA. I really didn't kind of connect personally with that expression of faith until church camp. So I went to a Lutheran camp in Arizona called Aloma, Arizona Lutheran Outdoor Ministry Association, and it was life-changing for me. I was there as a young camper and then was invited to be an assistant counselor. I was a CIT, what do they call it? A counselor in training, that's what it is. And in middle school, and it revolutionized how I think about the faith, and that rooting in the faith became real to me in that context. And it was there that I really heard a call to teach the Bible, which at the time I assumed was kind of a call toward being a pastor. But I felt such a deep disjunction between my experiences at camp, which were very tangible and impactful, and my experience at church back in my ELCA congregation. And so it set me on this kind of interesting journey where I was kind of floating back and forth between my ELCA church, which had a fantastic pastor, in fact. His name is, he's now retired, Steve Bergeson, a Norwegian pastor, also a graduate of Luther Seminary, but he had been through kind of the charismatic renewal of the 1970s. And so he had this like ability to pastor me and to recognize some of the things I was experiencing because he had been through it himself and was deep. So he was just a perfect guide. But I was kind of going back and forth between evangelical charismatic communities and the ELCA. And that kind of was all through college. I went to Pacific Lutheran University and really was not much involved with Lutheran campus ministry at all. I was part of a number of charismatic groups and met my wife there and so it was really kind of deeply embedded within charismatic and even Pentecostal Christianity until I went to Luther Seminary as a master's student to study Old Testament with the great and now deceased Terry Fretheim. And that's where I really reconnected. It's where I was able to hear the gospel as Lutherans sing it, sort of in a native kind of way, and in a way that connected with my experiences of the Spirit among charismatic Christians, you know? So that's a really lengthy answer, Lauren,
No, that's fine. That's fine.
That's sort of the trajectory and really where I find myself still today is trying to negotiate these different expressions of Christianity, both of which I deeply value, but also have criticisms of as well.
Yeah.
You know, as you might imagine.
Yeah, that's good. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, you bet.
What are some spiritual practices that have been meaningful for you?
Yeah. Well, as a Bible kind of guy, wrestling with Scripture in really detailed ways and with its particularities are really, really important for me. And that extends to really deeply engaging the Jewish tradition as well. The other covenant community, as it were, that exists on this earth, and it's just very important for me through friendships and through deep study to be engaged with Judaism and with its own kind of body of post-biblical literature, you know, sort of the rabbinic body of literature. So that's one, is to be engaged in an interfaith way. Second is just the engagement with Scripture itself, with the biblical text. And then I think thirdly, intercessory prayer, praying for others. This is a spiritual practice that I have really appreciated getting from my Pentecostal and charismatic friends, that's sort of standing in the gap on behalf of others or behalf of institutions or one's family and friends is just a really important thing for me and something that I continue to return to.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for sharing all that. Well, I had Michael on the pod. I've been following his work loosely here for a while and reached out and said, hey, you know, I'd love to have you on and talk about some stuff. And he sent me an article for potential discussion that really resonated with me. It's an article called Faithfulness in a Time of Collapse. So catchy title there. Cultivating Seeds of Hope, written by him and Dwight Zscheile, who I've had on the pod in the past. And I guess maybe I'll ask you the question I usually ask authors. Like, I mean, this is, I don't want to say clickbait, but the headline grabs your attention.
Yep.
Talk about, like, you know, what kind of inspired the idea of writing this article.
Yeah. We should have made it even more clickbaity, you know, and maybe said something like, if you can answer these 3 questions, you are clearly living in a time of collapse. No, but it is okay. So the title is seizing. It is meant to seize the attention of the reader, and part of that is that, you know, it's an article about Jeremiah in part,
right?
And Jeremiah as a prophet is a very dramatic person. By which I mean, and for him, it's life and death, right? Like he is trying to catch the attention of his audience because he believes that something imminent and dangerous is about to happen to them. And we see this throughout the prophets, that many of them are using visual means, auditory means, textual means to try and get the attention of their people because they think they have something important to say. And so it's an article that focuses especially on Jeremiah and some of the connections between his own kind of age of collapse in which he lived, and what Dwight and I perceive to be a potential moment of collapse for us within mainline denominations.
Yeah, I mean, I think I just had Ryan Burge on, who's an American Baptist, and I think in the Stuck book I mentioned, they both have statistics in there. I mean, it's not pretty. It's just it's a drastic slide downward for most mainline Protestant denominations. And you have kind of 5 points in the article, and the first one I think is frankly I appreciate the most, and that's what call a thing what it is. And let me just share, from my perspective, I work in a lot of different contexts. Interestingly enough, the church I'm serving in now is the 5th Christian tradition I've worked in technically, which is kind of fun. But one of the things that I see that, and frankly really annoys me, is I feel like in so many mainline Protestant traditions, there's this kind of I don't know even know what to call it. It's just naivety, pretending it's not really as bad as it is, which just drives me insane. And I get this whole and I imagine you'd agree, thinking in terms of abundance rather than scarcity is a good thing, but also when we're constantly bleeding money, we need to be honest about that. So talk more about kind of this idea of calling a thing what it is, and you have this quote, or you and Dwight have a quote: leaders must be clear-eyed and transparent about the challenges that we're facing. So can you talk more about that?
Yeah, thank you. That's an important question. Let me start with Jeremiah because that's what I know best. One of Jeremiah's greatest challenges was dealing with denial. And I think that is true for us today as well. That and the hardest work of leadership really is determining what the right questions are to be asking, and then as a follow-up, persuading people to see those questions as the critical ones, because there are all kinds of questions that we could potentially ask in a given moment. The questions is which are the right ones and to what end. And so I think one of the hardest things we have to do is to call a thing what it is, but then also the follow-up to persuade people to see it in such a way. And this is so much of what Jeremiah had to do. I think about his famous temple sermon in chapter 7, where he is really trying to convince people that it's not okay for them to come to the temple of the Lord and to call on God's name and then to do harm to their neighbor or to misuse God's name, and then to assume that there won't be repercussions, or that there won't be that the seeds will never come to fruition. And so that's the denial that Jeremiah is facing, is that people don't want to recognize that their deeds will bear fruit.
Now, you offer a really practical, but also I think pretty wise recommendation for pastors. And I've heard this, I think, in a similar way from someone like Tom Rainier, a Baptist, Southern Baptist guy. Him and his podcast, him and his co-host will often talk about kind of strategic patience. You kind of have the inverse here of disappointing at a rate people can stand, which is interesting. Talk more about that, what that idea is, and maybe what it looked like on a practical level.
Well, look, Jeremiah lives in a deeply disappointing time. Nobody wants to hear that their most precious institutions, like in the case of ancient Israel, the kingship and their this beautiful city of Jerusalem, which is really it is the city of God, right? Is potentially going to fall depending on the actions that they take. Nobody wants to hear that. It's not just disappointing; it's devastating news. And so, but that's part of the call. I think part of the difficult call of leadership and to be in Christian leadership is to offer that news. Thankfully, though, calling a thing what it is and confessing a thing for what it is deeply part of our tradition, right? At least within like Lutheran. Well, it's not just for Lutherans, but we often do a confession each week, right?
Yeah.
It might sound something like we confess that we are in bondage to sin and cannot free ourselves. So what does that look like institutionally for us to say we confess that we as a congregation or an institution are also deeply bound to our own sin, and the fruits of it are everywhere to see? How might God be calling us into a new day, or how might the Spirit be summoning us into new life? And so calling a thing what it is really looking ourselves squarely in the mirror with the help of the Holy Spirit and saying, now God, what will you do?
The second thing you have here is to not be or don't be distracted. And I immediately thought of, and I think this is the challenge that many church leaders are facing as we, come out of COVID or whatever, after COVID 2020 is wrestling with, like we talked about with our mutual acquaintance friend Ryan Panzer, and a lot of his work talks about like what needs to stay in line, what should be done in person, how do you know what's worth keeping, what's worth leaving. You're right that much of the activity, at least as I'm reading this, in church is simply distracting from the core work of cultivating Christian faith, identity, and discipleship in contemporary culture. So the question is, and I'm kind of long-winded here, is there too much happening? Is there too much church activities happening?
Yeah, I think part of what we're trying to do there is to invite people to consider that, like, the many congregations that I've been a part of are very reluctant to let go of kind of habits and practices that have been there a very long time, and are hesitant to say, does this particular practice, whatever it might be, continue to serve our primary calling within this community? Now, there are some ways in which that it has to be determined on a congregation by congregation basis, right? Because there are some congregations that will be called into a particular kind of ministry, and others that will be called into others. So it has to be sort of done there. We're just trying to urge people to ask the question, like, is this life-giving, what we're doing here? Does it serve the core function of the church? And if the answer, is no, then here comes again sort of the call of the leader to kind of deliver disappointing news, or at least to help shepherd a process that might result in disappointment and maybe even legitimate pain. That's part of the challenge there too. So we just want people to be open to asking that question, but in order to effectively ask that question, you have to know why you exist.
Yeah.
Why does the church exist? What is it there for? And here I would point us to the ministry of the gospel, to the ministry to the marginalized, to the call to be a place where the gospel can be clearly heard in the vernacular of the community.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. So a follow-up question, if I can, and correct me here if I'm off base, or maybe I'm taking this too literally, but I wonder, like, are we expecting too much of church? And so I'm thinking here of in the United Church of Christ, they have this kind of be the church statements where it says, protect the environment, care for the poor, forgive often, reject racism, fight for the powerless, share earthly and spiritual resources, embrace diversity, love God, enjoy this life, which are all fabulous, wonderful missions, each one in and of itself. But I wonder, and again, correct me if you disagree here, like, is asking a church to be all that, is that too much?
Yeah, it's a good question. My mind immediately goes to the topic of vocation, which was really important to Luther, and for Luther, vocation is really all. I'd like to think about it as all of the different ways in which this world lays a claim on us, or all of the different ways in which we are summoned in the world in response to its needs and pain and hope. And so while the church as an institution, may not specifically be called, a given community church or whatever, be specifically called to address every single one of those needs, I think as human beings, we are
Right.
called in various and mysterious ways to respond to, again, the hopes, pains, needs, dreams of the world around us. And so I would say that all of those topics are just different ways of naming the neighbor and different kinds of neighbors. And how we as an individual congregation or the church more broadly decide or are called to address them is a sort of a different question, I think.
Yeah. Good. Thanks for sharing that. The fun thing whenever I talk to folks from, Lutheran, Methodist tradition, you all have your people you go back to. And I always laugh about our friends in the PCUS there, who do they have a guy that I always name?
Well, Calvin probably would be of a great, or Karl Barth would be of great importance to them.
Oh, that's good. That's fair. Fair enough. Yes.
Within the Reformed tradition, there are a lot of great Reformed theologians that come out of, that they lean on.
Yeah.
For me, it's Luther, right?
Yeah. I'm ordained disciples of Christ, so it's always Alexander Campbell. Woohoo!
That's great.
All right. Back to focus here. The third point you have is identifying the remnant. And this is something I really appreciate. Again, as the article tried to find or look for some more hopeful things. You ask these questions: what work does church do in people's lives? And I'm wondering, I imagine this is probably something you have experienced with your background in charismatic Christianity and Pentecostal Christianity, the importance of testimony. I grew up independent Baptist, so it was more restrained, but testimony was still an important part of that faith tradition. Sharing our stories, talk more about that, what that might look like.
This is really important to me, and one of the many gifts that I received from my evangelical colleagues, Pentecostals, charismatics, is the spiritual practice of testifying to how God has been at work in your life. And it's something that the main line has really lost track of in a lot of ways, and to their own loss. I think part of it is just I think there's a class element here where there's a deep discomfort among many to talk about how God might actually be at work in the world, and to sort of make that claim and to do so from, the particularities of your own story. And I sort of get that, right? But it is nonetheless, I think, a practice we're called. It is something that the Bible, I think, summons us into. And we, of course, will do it imperfectly, but I do think it's an important part of our kind of evangelistic witness, and also just an important part of the way that we identify God's work in our midst. I mean, just think about how when there isn't a practice of publicly testifying to how God is at work in congregation members' lives, it denies people an opportunity to see how God might be at work in their lives in surprising ways as well.
Yeah.
And, I just think there's a real gift in being able to testify about God's work.
What are some practical ways you've seen it played out? I mean, in mainline contexts.
Yeah, so before I left Luther Seminary, there was a great group of students, staff, and faculty who had these talks called Why Jesus? And basically they would just invite different people over the lunchtime period to talk about why Jesus mattered, for them in their lives. And it was just so moving to hear the different stories. I myself had a chance to talk about that too, and to just hear about places that people have been and how they see the Lord accompanying them in those places. So this is a practice. This is a practice that I think we need to be leaning into very heavily.
Yeah. Well, speaking of leaning, the fourth point you and Dwight make is to lean on God. You're right. Yes. We are not alone. And maybe this is the hardest thing for our good mainline friends for us to remember. Perhaps that we're not alone and we can lean on God. Talk more about where that comes from and what you hope for it.
Yeah. Well, there are many signs, I think, that our denominational structures are in the midst of collapse, and that can be a very scary thing. But I think it's important to remember that the collapse of a denomination is not the same thing as the failure of the gospel, right? God has a mission in this world. God has a longing. God's heart beats for this entire creation, and God will make sure that mission is accomplished. That's part of what God promises, right, to this world, is that there will one day come a time when what is now promised will be reality. And so God, that's not the issue, is the gospel going to fail, right? Mm-hmm. The question is whether our institutions at this given moment, our churchly institutions, are equipped and to be partners in that task, to be agents within the world for that task. And so, so that's kind of scary, right? Institutions collapsing. It's a slow collapse, to be sure, over many decades, but it's one that's been in the process for a long time and that we have largely been in denial of. And but in the midst of collapse, it's easy to be scared. What I think we are called to, though, is to trust. And let me share an image with you that my former teacher, Terry Fretheim, used to use when he taught Jeremiah. He would say that Jeremiah, think about a kind of canoe that is floating down a river and that is very slowly moving toward a waterfall. Mm-hmm. And imagine Jeremiah is in the canoe with all these people saying, hey, look, this waterfall is coming. We should probably try to move the boat ashore. And he fails to convince them ultimately. And so they are going to go over the edge. And after they go over that edge, God is going to be there in the canoe on the other side to help pick up the pieces. And so even though we are going through a time of profound collapse, it's important that we remember that we are that we are accompanied in that sort of dark night of the soul, or in that time of deep sorrow, that we do not walk it alone, even mm-hmm. though it will be a time of profound pain, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. Let me ask something more practical, perhaps. And this is my observation. You might perceive things or feel things differently. Something that I notice is I feel like, years ago I used to think that denominations would collapse from the top down. And I sort of wonder if it's going to be the inverse, where, again, at least as I see it, in my context, local churches close, middle judicatories kind of sell their buildings, eat up that profit, or take those earnings from the sale of buildings and property. They seem to ask more and more of local pastors, which again, in my context, feels like it limits the work that local pastors can do in their neighborhoods and their church ministries. Like, A, do you think that's an unfair observation? And then B, like, what do you think in this time of collapse we need to be asking from our institutional authorities, leaders, structures?
Yeah, I'm not sure what to think about the sort of bottom up, top down. I just don't have an opinion on it yet.
Sure.
But what I would say about what we need to be doing now is, like Jeremiah, we need to be thinking in the very long term. And we need to be thinking in terms of kind of the way that a farmer thinks in terms of seasons.
Yeah.
And so the question to my mind is, what seeds ought we be planting now? What land needs to be tilled right now? What is the work that needs to be done that is at the core kind of calling of the life of the church? Again, the preaching of the gospel, the making of disciples, the caring for the marginalized. However a person kind of thinks about that core work, that needs to be sort of our exclusive focus, is our core work together in determining what that expression looks like locally. And then hopefully our kind of denominational leaders will help us to identify that and invest in it really heavily, even though saying yes to one thing might be saying no to another. And that's the hard work of leadership.
Yeah. Yeah. I recently read the book, The Infinite Games by Simon Sinek.
Yep.
And I don't know about his faith background or whatever, but I really resonated with the book, because I kind of loathe most business practices today. And I really loved he spent like a chapter bashing Milton Friedman, which I thought was totally warranted. But more broadly speaking, it really resonated with me because I look at myself and think of myself as like someone who's invested in, to use his words, the infinite game, the kingdom of God. So for me, like, I'm like, I believe I'm I believe that the church is how I believe that we're supposed to, how the kingdom of God is going to get manifest, for instance. And so again, within that kind of context, it's a long-term game, to use your words. It's a long-term effort. Like, to go back to your second point or excuse me, your first point of disappointing at a rate people can stand, is that like a lot of the work just like saying, hey, like, we know this is a long game. We know this is an infinite game. Like, we're going to have a lot of losses here in the short term.
Yeah, and what those losses, I think that is an important part of the call, to be sure. And in fact, there's a great example of this happening within the book of Jeremiah. I'm sure your audience and you will be very familiar with the famous verse from chapter 29, right? Verse 11, for I know the plans that I have for you. It's an important chapter, but it's actually a chapter in which Jeremiah's primary goal is to disappoint them. and this is what's often missed in sort of the Americanization of that verse. And it's an epistle that Jeremiah writes to the leaders of in exile in Babylon, and basically he's still in conflict with prophets who are there in exile and who are saying to the people, hey, look, God's going to save us really soon. We're going home. Maybe even some of them were causing political disruption within the area. And part of what Jeremiah is doing is saying, no, we are going to be here a long time. You need to have kids, marry them off, and marry them off, and pray for the peace of the city, pray for its shalom, because in its shalom will be your shalom. And so he's really telling them to settle in, because there is going to be a future hope, and that hope will be one that many of the audience at that time would not see. It's a multi-generational hope. Yeah. And that's what that verse is about. It's, I know the plans that I have for you all. It's not you in the singular. It's you all as sort of my people, to bless you and to prosper you, etc. But that's going to be a future hope long off in the distance. And with our kind of current short attention spans, some of the most difficult work of leadership is the work where we sow the seeds that won't grow for generations. But that's what we have to do.
Boy, sowing the seeds that won't grow for generations. That's good. That's good. The last thing you have in the article is cultivating seeds of hope. And again, I think you kind of mentioned this quote here, but I'll read it again just because it stood out to me. The collapse of so many Christian institutions does not signal the end of of Christ's gospel ministry in the world and our calling to make disciples. How do we get away from perhaps this? I can't think of the word. Acclamation, equalization of our institutions as the Christian faith, or whatever, and cultivate those seeds of hope.
Yeah, I think part of what we have to do is look to other expressions of Christianity that have lived through seriously traumatic and difficult times. I think in particular of the Black church within America, which is a remarkable tradition, and it's very diverse, right? Like there is no sort of like single Black theology or whatnot, but it is a tradition that both tells the truth about how it sees the world and what it's experienced, but also is able in remarkable and I would say miraculous ways to find hope. And there are so many voices that a person could point to, and not all of them agree, with one another. But I think the kind of the decentralizing of especially mainline, predominantly white churches to sort of the margins of society, no longer putting it at the center, really is an uncomfortable place for it, but it's one where we need to really look to our kind of siblings in faith who have been in that space in many ways for their entire existences, and to say, okay, we have something to learn here.
Boy, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I have an episode probably before you on the Black church, but B, I think that's a great example because you think about some of even more practical matters within the Black church. I'm thinking like, often pastors are bivocational. There's a long tradition of, they certainly have a long tradition of community engagement and social activism. So there's that testimony there. Obviously they've been quote unquote, I hate the word successful, but they've been faithful, perhaps better word, through some serious cultural antagonism. So that's a great example. I appreciate that example.
Yeah, and if you need a guest recommendation, there's a fabulous pastor, former student, Pastor Timothy Jackson, who is in Minneapolis at Impact Living Christian Center, and is just he's in a Ph.D. program right now, studying African American theology, and is just highly articulate in these matters. He also has spent a lot of time in mainline, predominantly white spaces, and so he is just a great translator of his tradition to people, and somebody I'd highly recommend to you. But there are so many important voices within this space, and the question is whether we will be attentive to them.
Yeah, that's fabulous. Thanks for sharing that. Last thoughts before we take a break. I mean, again, this is something I intend this pod to be practical and helpful for pastors and church leaders. So talk, if you would, just maybe for a minute or two, like to a church leader, to a pastor. I mean, heck, I still hopefully have a few more years in my career in church ministry. What advice do you have for us, people like me, who are in this and hope to be in this for at least a few more years yet?
Yeah. No, ministry it is a challenging and too often lonely space. I highly encourage all pastors to have some kind of mentor or person who is a little bit further down the road, whether in age or just in wisdom, it doesn't matter. But you need to be walking this path with somebody else, preferably somebody who's well outside of your system, and that can kind of, again, call things as they are and help you to name them. So first, I'd say be accompanied. Second, I'd say you also, like we call for in the article, need to attend to these core spiritual practices, like whether that's in prayer or in scripture, whatever that looks like for you. Determine what those core spiritual practices are, and lean heavy into them, especially in times of adversity, which are surely to come.
Yeah,
just a couple things there.
Yeah, appreciate you sharing that. Let's take a break, and we'll come back with some closing questions. All right, we're back with Michael Chan, and again, the article, we'll make sure to include a link here in the show notes. Faithfulness in a Time of Collapse, Cultivating Seeds of Hope. Michael Chan co-wrote it with Dwight Zscheile. So these closing questions, Michael, I always encourage folks, you can take these as seriously or not as you'd like to, but if you're Pope for a day, what would that ideal day look like for you?
Oh, I would quit my job and eliminate the office for myself. I don't belong in that space. I think, but in all seriousness, and great love and affection for the Pope, in fact, and my Catholic brothers and sisters, I think the best thing that folks in higher leadership can do is to kind of look across their sort of spheres of responsibility, think about them kind of like a garden, and look for where that new and impactful growth is happening, and then invest in it, right? It's this kind of remnant principle that we lift up in the article. But the hard part there is recognizing that, this is we serve a God who is a God of both death and resurrection, right? And so sometimes, this is the hard part, sometimes the most important growth is happening in the midst of death. And so that's sort of the hard part about being attentive to the work of the Spirit, is that the Spirit is often at work under the sign of its opposite, right? Life, I mean, this is the crucifixion, right? Life looks like death. Death sometimes looks like life. And so I think that's one of the real challenges, is trying to pray for eyes to see how the Spirit is actually at work, especially when it looks to the contrary. I mean, I think about when David is anointed, right, in 1 Samuel, and Samuel shows up and they're like, all right, bring the sons out. And they don't even bring David out because they're like, there's no way this guy is going to be, anointed king. But he is, in fact, the one who is anointed. God sees differently than we do. And one of our prayers ought to be, God, help me to see as you do.
I'm writing that down here. God sees differently than we do. Always take lots of notes here, so gotta find some space on the page for that.
Yeah.
A theologian or historical Christian figure you'd want to meet or bring back to life.
Oh, those might be different things.
Go for
I
it.
was
Yeah.
telling someone the other day that I love beloved Martin Luther. He is, for me, my primary conversation partner. I don't think he'd do well in the age of Twitter. In fact, I would say just preemptively ban his account because we know it's not going to be good. And nonetheless, he's somebody I deeply admire and am critical of, but in part because he's so much a pastor. I think his best theology is done when he is operating within pastoral mode, and so that's kind of a part of Luther's life. I think that's often overlooked is the pastoral angle that he brings to just about everything that he does.
Who's the other one then?
That's a good question. Okay, so I'll just say this. I don't know who this is, but whoever wrote the Book of Ruth, I would like to meet that person.
Oh, okay. Sure.
The Book of Ruth is really kind of, my head is there often these days. It's really probably my favorite Old Testament book in the current moment. And I would like to know who that is, because whoever it is, whether it's a man or woman, we just don't know we don't know who wrote it. But we do know that this person is a brilliant literary mind, and I would like to, and a theological mind, and I would love the chance to meet them.
That's good. What do you think history will remember from our current time and place?
So this will pivot a little bit to some of the work I'm doing at Concordia College. I think we live in a moment of tremendous and profound mistrust in institutions, and the church is one of them. Oftentimes, I think in conversations about the church, it's really easy for us to focus on like trying to diagnose the problems with the church, and we fail to recognize that there is a system of distrust and a system-wide kind of distrust of many different institutions and disaffiliation from them. And, this is sort of famously accounted in Robert Putnam's work, Bowling Alone.
Yeah.
And I think we often miss the mark when we don't recognize that this is happening society-wide, and that the church is just one element there, one voluntary institution that people are moving away from. So that's important. So I think people will look back on this age and see it as a time of profound institutional distrust. And there's a great book by Yuval Levin called A Time to Build. And really what he's calling people to there is that we need to rebuild our institutions so that they are more trustworthy. And that is certainly a call for the church in the current moment.
Yeah, sounds fascinating. What are your hopes? What are your hopes for the future of Christianity?
Well, that we will attend to that. Well, that we will attend to some of the practices we name in the article. That we will learn to call a thing as it is, to see with clear eyes where we're at. But then we'll also recognize that even though we live in a time of collapse, God is with us, and God is doing new things. And my hope is that we will be able to perceive them, and that we'll be able to sort of put our shoulder to the plow in that work. And so those are my hopes for the future. And I have supreme hope that the Spirit will be at work, irrespective of how well we respond. So my hope, ultimately is in the God who makes promises to this world. Yeah.
Well, this has been a fabulous conversation. I really, really appreciate your time and insights. Share, if you would, how people can connect with you and the work you're doing now.
Yeah, so I work at Concordia College and am the executive director for Faith and Learning. So you can find me on their website and all the kind of different work that we're doing with the Lorentzsen Center, with the Dovre Center, and with some interfaith responsibilities and with campus ministry. So I'm kind of in a couple different places, but my main sort of hub is on Concordia College. You can also find me on LinkedIn, where I have a pretty a kind of robust posting schedule around a lot of the work that I'm doing. So,
and you've had another podcast going, right?
That's right. Yeah. So as part of the Lorentzsen Center is is kind of a public-facing forum that deals with questions at the intersection of society, faith, the economy, business. And this entire year, we're asking the question, and really into next year too, how do we build a more trustworthy world? And it's an important question. And as part of that, trying to respond to that question, we have a podcast that's called Builders, where we interview people who have built organizations, businesses, institutions that contribute to sort of building more trustworthy communities around them. So you can find that on all the normal podcatchers.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, again, thanks so much for your conversation, and really appreciate your time. I always leave folks with a word of peace, so may God's peace be with you.
Yeah, and to you as well. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. To learn more about Lauren or the podcast, visit future-christian.com. One more thing before you go. Do us a favor and subscribe to the podcast. And if you're feeling especially generous, leave a review. It really helps us get the word out to more people about the podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is a production of Torn Curtain Arts and Resonate Media. Our episodes were mixed by Danny Burton, and the production support is provided by Paul Romig-Levitt. Thanks, and go in peace.